So welcome everybody to the next session. The speaker today for this session is John Morton, and most of you will probably know John. He's been in native title, well, longer than I have. He's always been around as far as I know. He's worked in Aboriginal studies for more than 40 years as both consultant and academic. He taught anthropology at La Trobe University for over 20 years and remains a research associate in the university's Department of Social Inquiry. He also worked for 4 years as a curator at Museum Victoria during his tenure at La Trobe, and he currently takes on occasional work as an independent consultant and has previously undertaken land rights, native title and other research in New South Wales, the Northern Territory, Queensland, Victoria and Western Australia. He's published in a number of fields, principally Aboriginal religion and land tenure, and has authored many reports relating to land rights, native title and other applied matters. He retains particularly strong interest in the Arundik speaking peoples of Central Australia. And personally, I've always enjoyed John's presentations, whether it be on the Cronulla riots, on monsters, or on all manner of topics that he finds of interest. And so I'm really looking forward, John, to your talk on what is the Indigenous estate.
Thanks, Kim. I should just flag that I do have something implicitly to say about succession and tying in with the previous session, but that won't be really be able to be rendered explicit until I get some way into the way this paper works. And it's not a full paper at the moment, it's a presentation. So I'll go ahead and read it. It's a kind of thinking out loud exercise, and we'll see where it goes. So first of all, I'm not sure how recently the phrase the Indigenous estate was coined, but as the theme of this conference appears to suggest, it's difficult to think of its usage outside of the context of Australia's recent bureaucratic regimentation of rights and interests in land. Rightly, we are concerned with how anthropology can usefully and fairly ply its trade in this now very large arena, with its complex overlays of federal, state and otherwise local jurisdictions and remits. But in doing that and concentrating on relatively well-defined practical on-the-ground issues, we might sometimes lose sight of a bigger picture. And our phrase, the Indigenous estate, I think does seem to imply that there is such a thing beyond the dispersed practicalities of land claims, native title claims and heritage protection regimes. So that's what I want to think about a little, the big picture. What is the Indigenous estate? What, if anything, supports the definite article in that phrase? So one of the things that might strike you as interesting about the association of the Indigenous estate with the vast labyrinthine bureaucracy under the umbrella of Australian sovereignty is that rights and interest in land have been broadly framed and justified in terms of traditional ownership or traditional laws and customs. And you don't immediately think of the corridors and byways of legal protection and management when approaching those topics, I think. We're now very familiar with the idea of native title as a recognition space and how anthropologists work within that space, serving to model and translate laws and customs in a way that makes them intelligible to alien audiences. In doing that, we are generally bound to the specificities of a single case, amongst other things, trying to fathom the most appropriate way to frame the idea of society after Yorta Yorta. That's not always straightforward, and as Tony Redmond described, it's a good 10 years ago now, there's no necessary single answer to any particular society question, since it's going to depend to a degree on local history and how Aboriginal people have emerged from that history and elect to incorporate in response to it. However, to the best of my knowledge, no claim has put forward the idea of a pan-continental or a pan-Australian society of the type that a phrase like the Indigenous estate would seem to suggest. So can we conclude from that that this pan-Aboriginal entity is not traditional or not traditionally based? And I want to answer, no, you can't. Now, the primary meaning of estate in English, of course, refers to property, especially, but not exclusively, landed property. But it also has a secondary, more archaic reference to a class of people involved in a system of governance, like first estate, second estate, third estate, and so on. So the word derives from the Latin term status, state or condition, and that in turn is derived from the verb stare, to stand. So without getting too etymologically determinative about it, these connections suggest a relationship of equivalence between landed property and the persons or corporations who own it and have a more or less untrammeled right to put it to good use. As is often underlined, property is not a thing, it's a relationship. The sense of mutual belonging in this relationship is arguably universal. Persons belong to their property, but property belongs to them. Although that might be articulated differently across the recognition space, especially in relation to alienability. In this regard, we typically contrast the market with the dreaming, often implicitly or explicitly burdening the comparison with a great amount of moral freight. Hence, we end up with the ideological mantra that Aborigines don't own the land, they belong to it, as if these things are mutually exclusive. My teaching experience makes me say that it requires a massive effort to shift that public perception and make it more ethnographically or anthropologically informed. Now, the term estate, of course, is pervasive in the ethnography and anthropology that I'm talking about. At which point, of course, we come to Bill Stanner and the 1965 refinement of the term in his sympathetic working of Radcliffe Brown. The estate, he said, and you could all repeat after me and you could probably say it along with me, was the traditionally recognised locus, country, home, ground, dreaming place of some kind of patrilineal descent group, forming the core or nucleus of the territorial group. He'd later point out, or at least imply, that through religious or totemic affiliation with sites, people's relationships with defined territories and ancestors were indeed ultimately a matter of consubstantiality, of identification with country as much as ownership of country. Soon after, we would begin to understand much more about states being what they are in terms of ancestral connection and symbolic or religious relationship. Nancy Munn first comes to mind there. And much of that would help to define Aboriginal ties to land as inalienable and as primarily spiritual rather than economic, at least in the popular imagination. Now, the estates that Stanner had in mind were, of course, very, very small. And there was no conception of any estate beyond them. They were basic landowning units and are still largely viewed as such. Radcliffe Brown himself had not long earlier used the phrase corporate state for such a unit, and he suggested further that it includes not only rights over territory, but also rights in personam and in rem over its members, thus entailing corporate succession and the germs of the state and of sovereignty as we know them in more complex developments. Those are quotes. Stanner did not demur from this view. Were it an accurate account, there would evidently be no kind of traditional precedent for the Indigenous estate as it is conceived in current usage, which raises the question, is the Indigenous estate purely an artefact of the Australian political legal system? Is it wholly a post-colonial construction? Looked at in a certain light, I guess you would have to answer yes. Aboriginality, as we know it today, is certainly a long-term outcome of a master-slave dialectic and can't be divorced from the assumption of sovereignty by the Crown in and after 1788, which laid the ground for ethnogenesis. So when, for example, Bill Gammage suggests that before 1788, Aborigines made Australia as the biggest estate on earth, we do need to bear in mind that there was originally no such place as Australia as a politico-legal jurisdiction at that time. And if we stay with Radcliffe Brown and Stanner, we have to acknowledge that back in the day, or at sovereignty, as we say, the estates appear to have been multiple, fragmented and unconnected on a continental scale. I think there is something more to this than just semantics or word games. Like others, Gamage clearly doesn't simply use Australia to describe some mere physical entity or island continent. He extensively uses the term as we use it to refer to a nation state, one that is in need of a good dose of authenticity and historical accounting, much like Tim Flannery has before him, and much like Bruce Pascoe has mostly after him. There's a strong inclination to think anachronistically about Australia when it comes to its Indigenous people. They are the first Australians, First Nation peoples of Australia, Australians before the fact. That is not surprising given the nature of the master-slave dialectic, because that history is the driver behind ethnogenesis in the case of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. The point I would make about that, especially after the recent debates about the empirical adequacy of the work of Bruce Pascoe, is that when it comes to a national accounting and the manner in which citizens generally approach moral questions about Australia's history, drawing fine-grained attention to best evidence a la Peter Sutton and Karen Walsh, while critically important, is not necessarily effective in addressing the problem of misleading information. There's a well-worn distinction between scientific truth, which is arrived at by weeding out falsehoods through logic and methodologically informed reinvestigation, research, and narrative truth, which in Jerome Bruner's words is only truth insofar as it achieves verisimilitude, that is, conformity to convention and something called narrative necessity. It strikes me that in Pascoe-induced chapters of the history wars in recent times, there hasn't always been evidence of much negative capability in the sense of being able to hold those two types of truth in tandem. Indeed, much of the defence of Dark Emu has simply been along the lines of, but it's a really good story. Forget the details for now, because this isn't a paper about Dark Emu, although it could be construed as one about the title of the biggest state on earth. Is the reality of that title something that could be or should be refuted by arguments, bringing to bear a welter of empirical evidence about the multiplicity of at-sovereignty Aboriginal estates and their relative independence from each other? Should we be emphatic that there was no one estate and that the estates that did exist weren't particularly big? It's not as if the question has no importance, since one of the long-standing objections to treaty making in Australia has been the assertion that with so many different tribes, there has been no broadly legitimate entity with whom to negotiate. Perhaps ironically in this context, one of the ethnographically informed arguments that says that we shouldn't be in too much of a hurry to fragment the continent into estates or merely local polities comes from Peter Sutton. I have in mind his concepts of underlying title and proximate title. Now, I just want to put up something, share screen for a bit. A few decades ago, David Moaljali drew a map of Australia and described it as a prone human body whose navel was Uluru. He had none of the mostly straight lines that are conventionally used to outline the states and territories, but instead was filled with places and paths, a rhizomic network. The places, he said, were communities, together with their symbols and languages, while the paths or tracks were the way in which stories travelled along trade routes, connecting everyone and everywhere through exchange. When he was asked about areas where people were no longer living a traditional life, he replied that their land remained and that an ancestral imprint continued to act for its people. That strikes me as a cogent ethnographic confirmation of what Sutton calls underlying title. Sutton himself noted that the idea of underlying title was apt because of the way it is connected to ancestral embodiment in country, as opposed to the kind of entitlement which Radcliffe Brown and Stanner had in mind, which Sutton renamed proximate title, underlying title was likened to the idea of crown, in the sense that it was radical or root title out of which estates or proximate titles could be legitimately distributed by some regional politico-legal regime. And that's where the succession issue comes back to this paper. His thinking on this to some extent predated native title, but it has been in the native title context that the dual structure of tenure has proved important with respect to the idea of society. Even in those areas where there's very clear evidence of the Radcliffe-Brown-Stanner model having been at work, such as in Arnhem Land, it's equally evident that no estate has existed as an island. Its title is fully dependent on the regional system of law. Sutton compared underlying title or the dreaming with the crown, partly in terms of them both being fictions or superorganic constructions that are legally real. One could, I think, equally refer to them as condensed symbols of historical precedent, the law of the land reduced to a personified ancestral principle. But in one respect, the dreaming and the crown do not have much in common: mapping. Sutton himself notes that it may be extraordinarily difficult to demarcate the extent of any regional polity, due to sharp breaks in jurisdiction being rarely, if ever, encountered. Always a frustrating matter for those servants of the crown, all of us, who want a line drawn around everything in order to be unambiguous about inclusion and exclusion. A boundary is to cross, as Nancy William once said of Yolngu territoriality, and it is now commonplace for us to emphasise that in traditional law and custom, exclusive possession as the right to be asked is paradoxically mostly marked by practices of inclusion. And I think that is what you see in the Moaljali map, which is in effect a continuous polity where lines are paths, not borders, where country is an inclusive network rather than a hierarchical mosaic, as Ian Keane would correct. Would it be reasonable to say then that at sovereignty, this was the biggest estate on earth? To wind up, I think this is a good story to tell, and one that can be ethnographically supported by treating the continent as a single regional system and getting to grips with it as a transformational landscape in which people were not only largely multilingual, but also largely multicultural. Of course, the devil's in the detail, although I don't think it would be difficult to amass examples of ceremonial and marital exchange networks which lend the lie to the idea of fully independent tribes or language groups, let alone fully independent estates. The Western Desert, often held to be completely exceptional in this respect, would have to be included in spite of conditions there having given rise to landed property having its distinctive caste, but not one which has made Western Desert groups exclusive in terms of principle and practice, as Ian Keane has noted. In fact, the Western Desert is, to my mind, the best example of how underlying title works at a regional level. This because of the flexibility of claims and general instability of estate formation, as well as the relatively well-documented way in which Western Desert peoples have been able to negotiate intensive business with others outside of the Western Desert under a broad umbrella of law. More could be said about that, and I was originally intended to do so, but I don't have the time. But I guess the main point I want to put over today is that the idea of underlying title, and I should probably stop sharing at that point, that the idea of underlying title is a conceptual tool of great significance. My impression is that it is seriously underutilized in relation to both applied and academic anthropology, which are still overdetermined by the estate range problematic, as well as in areas of public discourse concerning Indigenous identity, voice, and representation. I suggest that Moaljali's map is a good place to start thinking the matter through, especially in view of its placement of Uluru as the nation's navel. Below Uluru, Moaljali placed the rainbow serpent, wood, as a synthetic pan-totemic being, an inclusive gesture based on his Kimberley-oriented understanding of the dreaming, an Uluru statement from the heart before the fact. That was in 1993. The 2017 statement spoke explicitly of this ancestral condition across the continent as the sovereignty that coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. That is what we, as anthropologists, can rightly refer to as the dreaming or underlying title. That's as far as I can take it now.
I'm not quite sure. I think, are you waiting for questions, Craig, or I can't read?
Yes, I was. Thanks, John. There's a question here, John. It's relating to the metaphor of Indigenous estate in relation to health systems. I'm not quite sure that I understand that question, so I might leave that aside for the moment. Are there any other questions coming in?
I can't write a question, so I might jump in. I mean, I would just be curious, John, because you mentioned succession and how the concept of underlying title relates to that. But I would just be curious about your thoughts of how that sort of expansive model, in the sense that you just outlined, relates to the previous discussion about this, succession happening within fairly narrow, small-scale estates. And how do you see that playing out, I guess, across the country?
Yeah, I think as I hinted there, we're kind of over determined a bit and over conditioned by that debate which happened with Radcliffe Brown and Stanner and Hyatt, and the clarification about what an estate was by Stanner. And so we've kind of had that for a long time, in spite of the fact that we have problematized the whole idea of traditional ownership quite dramatically since then. So the first real sort of overturning of that as a principal concern came, of course, with Meyer's work on the Western Desert, but it also happened in relation to the earlier land rights claims, where a lot of people kept saying, well, no, we're not just a patrilineal descent group. We are a group of people that have responsibility for this particular tract of company of land that happens to be part of a larger one, which we are married into, and so on and so forth. And some of those people who have their patrilineal country over there need to be included in a traditional owner group here. So all those issues were undoing the estate logic that we had worked with before. And what we ended up with, I think, is a kind of odd misapprehension about what succession is, because we talk about succession only when it's not patrilineal succession, as if patrilineal succession is not succession. So we see, and as if we see anything that's not patrilineal succession as irregular succession, and in a sense that certainly would be the case in many ethnographic circumstances, including Arnhem Land, it seems. But I do think we need to stop talking about succession like it's it's only something that happens in extraordinary circumstances, because we should be more used to the idea that country is held as our wider estate, and the limitations of that holding through the relationship to ancestors, which are all interconnected, of course, is in spatial terms very, very difficult to define.
Thanks, John. Keep the questions rolling in. The lines are free. John, in your talk, you posed the question, is the Indigenous estate an artefact of the Australian political and legal system? Did you want to expand on that question?
Yeah, I think I hinted at my answer really in talking about negative capability between telling two kinds of stories, you know, one based on empirical evidence and one based on what we judge to be a good story and a bad story. And I think the answer is in fact yes and no. I think that, you know, something like the statement from the heart is clearly something that would not have been reproducible or duplicable, whatever the word might be, in the old days. But I also think that it is something that you can say has arisen out of what remains of the laws and customs of the people of Australia. So it's a yes, and I think it is a yes and no thing, and I think we have to be extremely careful sometimes when we put sort of empiricist critiques about what things were like in the old days forward as sort of pure critiques of narratives that are, as it were, good narratives, but are not well supported by the people who are telling them. And I don't, in fact, think that Sutton and Walsh are in that category of undermining Pascoe that much, in my view. They're just correcting something about some of the things that he said.
Thanks, John. I'm still waiting for questions. Kim, did you have another question for John?
No, I do not. And I also, I mean, we are essentially on time now. A few seconds left, I think. So we might just wrap it up then. Thank you, John. And oh, there is a comment now. I don't know if
there's one more question there now.
Do you want to?
They're fairly lengthy comments. We might have to leave them in this session now, Kim.
Yeah.
So back to you, Kim.
Okay, well, in that case, wrapping up, and I've been asked to remind everybody that the next session is on in 10 minutes. So just a quick break. All right.
Thanks, everyone.